Below is a long, continuous narrative told in the warm, engaging tone of a seasoned storyteller that weaves together suspense, drama, and the bittersweet saga of an American farmer whose life was transformed by a fateful discovery. Settle in, dear listener, for this is the story of Henry Hank McAllister, a man whose world turned upside down when a hidden treasure beneath his land opened the door to dreams and ultimately to a tragic unraveling of everything he once held dear. I remember the day as if it were etched in the very fabric of time. It was an early spring morning on the outskirts of a small Kansas town, where the endless sky stretches above wide fields of amber and green. Hank, a rugged and humble farmer with calloused hands and a heart as vast as the plains he tended, awoke with a sense of quiet determination. Life on the farm was a tapestry of routine and labor, a cycle of planting, nurturing, and reaping that had been passed down through generations. But on that crisp morning, something stirred beneath the soil of his family's old homestead, a secret waiting to be unearthed. Hank had long been curious about the stretch of land that lay at the edge of his property, a barren expanse that his father and grandfather had deemed unworthy of cultivation. With the sun barely peeking over the horizon, he set out with his trusty shovel and a spirit of adventure, determined to see if there was more to that forgotten patch than met the eye. As he dug deep into the earth, his shovel struck an object hard and unyielding. At first, Hank thought it might be an old rock, but as he chipped away at the surrounding soil, he discovered a rusted iron chest. The chest, covered in layers of dirt and age, seemed almost to pulse with a mysterious energy. With trembling hands, Hank pried open the lid, revealing a dazzling array of relics. Gold coins that glinted like captured sunlight, antique jewelry encrusted with precious gems, and curious artifacts whose origins were shrouded in myth. The treasure, it seemed, was the legacy of a forgotten era, a bounty amassed by distant ancestors whose stories had long faded into legend. In that moment, Hank's life took a sharp turn. The modest farmer, who had once known only the steady rhythms of rural existence, suddenly found himself in possession of a fortune that could change everything. News of the discovery spread through the local community like wildfire. Neighbors, once his equals in hard work and honest toil, now eyed him with a mixture of envy and wonder. They whispered in hushed tones about the miracle that had befallen Hank, a man who had uncovered riches hidden right beneath his feet. For a while, the newfound wealth felt like a divine blessing. Hank invested in new machinery for the farm, repaired the creaking farmhouse, and even built a small wing for his ailing mother. A kind gesture that reinforced his image as a humble, generous soul who had merely been granted stroke of luck. Yet, as the days wore on, the lure of wealth revealed its darker side. The treasure, initially a symbol of hope and renewal, began to cast a long shadow over Hank's heart. It was as if every glimmer of gold and every sparkle of a gemstone whispered promises of a life filled with luxury and ease, a life that was infinitely more dazzling than the rugged simplicity he had known all his life. The seed of extravagance, once planted in his mind, soon sprouted into wild ambitions that he could scarcely control. Hank started spending lavishly on things he had never even dreamed of: a brand new truck with gleaming chrome, fine clothes that replaced his old work overalls, and dinners at upscale restaurants where he dined with people who spoke in refined tones and carried themselves with an air of sophistication foreign to the dusty world of the farm. As Hank's fortune grew, so too did the extravagant lifestyle that accompanied it. Friends and distant relatives began to appear, drawn by the promise of share in his newfound wealth. Invitations flowed into glittering parties, where laughter and music masked the underlying tension of envy and suspicion. Hank, intoxicated by the thrill of sudden riches, found himself slipping into a world that was as alluring as it was dangerous. The simple values of his upbringing, the importance of hard work, humility, and respect for the land, began to erode beneath the weight of his excesses. At first, the transformation was subtle. A few extra hours spent at the local bar, a penchant for expensive cigars, and an occasional splurge on gifts that seemed designed to impress. But soon, the changes became undeniable. Hank's once steady hands, so used to the rhythm of plowing fields and sowing seeds, began to tremble as he signed contracts and made deals with slick businessmen. He invested heavily in ventures that promised even greater returns, ventures that were as unpredictable as the weather on the open plains. The money, once a blessing, became a torrent that swept him along a path of unchecked indulgence and reckless decisions. Even as Hank's wealth expanded, a dark tension simmered beneath the surface. It was during one of those long, restless nights, when the wind howled across the barren fields and the old farmhouse creaked under the weight of memories, that Hank began to sense that not all treasure was meant to be spent. The once joyful sparkle of his newfound fortune had dimmed, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. The lavish parties and expensive trinkets no longer filled the void within him. In their place grew a deep-seated anxiety, as though each extravagant purchase was another link in an unbreakable chain that bound him to a destiny of ruin. As the seasons changed, so did Hank's fortunes. The brilliant glow of wealth began to flicker and wane, replaced by the creeping realization that his riches were vanishing as swiftly as they had appeared. His forays into risky business ventures started to fail, and the once promising investments turned sour. The local community, which had once marveled at his transformation, now cast wary glances his way. Rumors began to circulate about mismanagement and squandered opportunities, a cautionary tale in the making. Hank's once pristine fields, which had sustained generations of his family, fell into disrepair as he neglected the very land that had given him his fortune. The tractors sat idle, the crops withered, and the promise of prosperity faded into a harsh reality. One autumn evening, as the wind swept across the barren fields with a mournful cry, Hank sat alone on the porch of his sprawling, now impersonal mansion. The twilight draped the landscape in melancholy hues of purple and gray, and the silence was broken only by the distant rustle of dying leaves. In that quiet moment, as the memories of simpler times washed over him, Hank began to confront the bitter truth. The treasure that had once promised him a better life had instead become a curse, draining him of his essence and isolating him from the very community that had nurtured his roots. The transformation was not immediate, but the path to ruin had been set long ago. Hank's excessive spending had led him into a labyrinth of debts and broken promises. Friends who had once shared in his joy now turned away, and the laughter of the parties was replaced by the hollow echo of regrets. Legal troubles mounted, and creditors came knocking on the doors of his once idyllic estate. Each day, as the weight of his miscalculations pressed down upon him, Hank found himself sinking deeper into despair. The treasure, once a beacon of hope, had become a relentless reminder of his own hubris, a cruel irony that the riches buried beneath his land were not enough to fill the emptiness that had grown within him. Yet, amidst the ruin, there remained a stubborn spark, a remnant of the man he once was. In the quiet hours of the early morning, when the world was still and the stars shone with a gentle light, Hank would find himself wandering back to the old fields. There, among the whispering grasses and the enduring earth, he sought solace in memories of his ancestors, the hard-working souls who had labored on this very land with unwavering dignity and perseverance. In those moments, he could almost hear the faint murmur of their voices, urging him to remember that true wealth was not measured in gold or jewels, but in the strength of character and the bonds of community. Haunted by the ghosts of his squandered fortune and tormented by the realization that he had lost himself in the pursuit of empty pleasures, Hank faced a choice. Would he continue down the path of self-destruction, surrendering to the allure of material excess? Or could he find a way to reclaim the values that had once defined him, the simple, steadfast virtues that had sustained his family for generations? It was a turning point that weighed heavily on his heart, a moment when the scales of fate balanced precariously between redemption and irreversible ruin. In the days that followed, the land itself seemed to reflect Hank's inner turmoil. The skies, once a brilliant blue, now wore a mantle of brooding gray, and the wind carried with it a chill that spoke of impending change. Neighbors, once sympathetic to his plight, now whispered of a curse, a belief that the treasure had come with a price too high to pay. They recalled old legends of fortunes found and lost, of families who had risen only to fall again under the relentless march of fate. And in hushed tones, they would say that Hank's discovery was not merely a stroke of luck, but the beginning of a long, inexorable descent into sorrow. One crisp morning, as the first frost of winter crept over the fields, Hank resolved to face his demons. With a heavy heart and a mind weighed down by regret, he set out to mend what he could of his shattered life. He began by returning to the very soil that had given him so much, plowing the neglected fields, repairing the old barn, and tending to the land with a newfound reverence. Each act of labor was a silent prayer for redemption, a promise to the ghosts of his past that he would not let the treasure define him. Slowly, as the earth responded to his gentle touch, hints of renewal emerged. The crops, though modest, began to show signs of life. The once dormant fields whispered of hope with every green shoot that broke through the frost. Yet, the path to recovery was fraught with obstacles. The debts that had piled up over the years loomed like dark clouds on the horizon, and the bitter taste of betrayal, both from those who had once celebrated his rise and from his own misjudgments, remained ever present. Hank found himself grappling with a profound loneliness, a sense of isolation that no amount of money could ever mend. The friends who had once flocked to his side during the days of excess were now few and far between, replaced by the stark reality of a man determined to rebuild his life from the ground up. In the quiet of a long winter's night, as the wind howled outside and the only light came from a flickering lantern, Hank sat on his porch and contemplated the twists of fate that had led him to this moment. The treasure buried beneath his land, once a symbol of limitless possibility, had been squandered in a haze of extravagance, a lesson learned too late in the relentless pursuit of fleeting pleasures. And yet, in that moment of stark introspection, Hank resolved that his downfall would not be the end of his story. Rather, it would serve as a foundation, a hard-won lesson upon which he could rebuild not only his fortunes, but the very essence of who he was. As the seasons turned once more, a cautious optimism began to seep into Hank's daily life. The fields, now nurtured with patience and care, yielded modest harvests that were a far cry from the riches of the past, but were imbued with the honest sweat of hard work. Neighbors started to take notice, not of the opulent mansion that had once stood as a monument to his folly, but of the man who had returned to the earth, whose calloused hands now told a story of resilience and renewal. The local community, ever superstitious yet hopeful, whispered that perhaps the curse of the treasure was lifting, that Hank's determination had begun to reverse the inexorable decline that had once seemed inevitable. But fate, ever the trickster, was not done with Hank just yet. One day, as the sun rose with a muted brilliance over the awakening fields, a stranger arrived in town. He was a man of quiet bearing and mysterious air, dressed in a worn suit that spoke of travels far beyond the borders of Kansas. This visitor, who introduced himself only as Mr. Dalton, claimed to have known of the legend of Hank's treasure for many years. His eyes, deep and knowing, held secrets that hinted at a past intertwined with myths and ancient promises. Mr. Dalton spoke softly of the legacy that the land held, a legacy of wealth and woe, of fortunes that were as much a blessing as a curse. He warned Hank that the treasure, while it had once brought him untold riches, also carried with it a burden of destiny that could not be escaped simply by spending or hiding away. The words of Mr. Dalton stirred something deep within Hank, a lingering memory of the simple values he had once cherished. The mysterious visitor recounted tales of ancestors who had respected the land and lived in harmony with its rhythms, of families who had nurtured their fortunes with wisdom rather than extravagance. He spoke of a covenant between the earth and those who tilled it, a promise that true prosperity could only be achieved when one balanced ambition with gratitude. As Mr. Dalton's words echoed in the still air of the farmhouse, Hank felt a stirring of hope, a fragile belief that perhaps there was still a way to salvage not only his fortune, but his very soul. Motivated by the visit and determined to atone for years of reckless indulgence, Hank embarked on a new chapter of his life, a solitary journey back to the fundamentals of hard work, respect for nature, and the true measure of wealth. He set aside the remnants of his former opulence, choosing instead to invest every spare moment and resource into restoring the land that had once cradled his family's dreams. Slowly, painstakingly, he rebuilt what had been lost. The fields, once barren from neglect and misuse, began to yield a humble bounty. Neighbors, initially skeptical of his transformation, started to lend their support. They shared seeds, offered advice, and in quiet, unspoken ways, helped Hank rediscover the beauty in simplicity. Yet, even as the earth healed beneath his steady hands, Hank's inner journey was far from over. The scars of his past, etched deeply by the memory of squandered fortune and broken promises, remained as constant reminders of the cost of his folly. Nights were long and filled with restless dreams of the glittering treasure that had once seemed so enchanting, and mornings brought with them the weight of regret. But with each day that dawned, Hank found a measure of strength in the routine of honest labor, in the steady pulse of life that thrived beneath the vast Kansas sky. In time, the once mighty storm of extravagance subsided into a gentle rain of redemption. Hank became a quiet figure in the town, a living testament to the possibility of renewal even after the deepest fall. The tale of the farmer who had found treasure in his land and lost it all in a haze of foolish spending became a local legend, recounted around campfires and over hearty meals. Parents warned their children of the perils of unchecked ambition, while elders spoke of Hank's eventual transformation as proof that even the most wayward soul could find its way back home. And so, dear listener, as you absorb the saga of Hank McAllister, a story that spans from the hopeful promise of a single dig in the earth to the tumultuous spiral of fortune squandered and finally to the quiet redemption found in honest toil, remember that life is as unpredictable as the shifting Kansas winds. Treasure, in all its dazzling allure, can seduce even the most grounded among us into a path of reckless abandon. Yet, within the heart of every fall lies the seed of renewal, waiting for the moment when one dares to pick it up and nurture it into something lasting. In the end, Hank's journey reminds us that true wealth is not measured by the glitter of gold or the flash of riches, but by the strength of character, the humility to learn from our mistakes, and the resilience to rebuild when all seems lost. His story, an epic of triumph and tragedy, of dreams inflated and hopes deflated, serves as a timeless parable for all who chase after fortune without pausing to consider the cost. For in the vast, unyielding plains of life, every treasure has its price, and every man must learn that some fortunes, once gained, can only be redeemed by the quiet dignity of a life rebuilt from the ruins of excess. Thus, as you sit beneath the expansive sky and listen to the rustling of the wheat in the breeze, let Hank McAllister's tale echo in your heart, a reminder that even when life leads us astray with promises of glittering wealth, the most enduring riches are those we earn with sweat, humility, and the unwavering love of the land that sustains us. And so, the legend of the American farmer who once found a hidden trove and lost everything to foolish extravagance lives on, a beacon of caution and a symbol of hope, urging us all to seek balance, to cherish what is truly valuable, and to remember that the greatest treasures are often found in the simplest moments of honest living.